When doctors say a baby was violently shaken, a parent or caretaker is charged with child abuse or homicide. Hundreds of people are being charged every year, and it's become a pop culture phenomenon. But it's come under attack as scientifically invalid by a growing number of doctors and scientists. One of the leaders of the group challenging shaken baby syndrome is a pathologist in Minnesota.
I'm a retired pathologist from Minnesota. I worked as the appointed coroner or medical examiner for a number of Minnesota counties. I worked with prosecutors and with defense attorneys in cases where I had determined that a death was due to unnatural causes, homicide. I came across shaken baby syndrome. Shaken baby syndrome was first developed as a theory 40 years ago, that infants with 3 specific signs or symptoms had injuries that were caused by violent shaking, and that nothing else could cause them. It was on the back burner until the early 90s.
Dr. Robert Reese is an expert on shaken baby syndrome. Dr. Reese demonstrated for us the amount of force required to cause these kinds of serious injuries.
Stop crying, stop crying. And the head will go back and forth approximately the way you saw on this.
Experts describe violent shaking as an insidious killer, not well understood. Because babies' neck muscles are so weak and their brains so fragile, just one forceful shake can do permanent damage or even kill.
It happens under stress. It happens as a result of infants crying inconsolably sometimes.
Experts say as many as 3,000 babies in the U.S. may be victims of shaking each year.
People who would never think of punching a child would become so enraged that they could shake a child.
The shocking image, the picture is of Ryan Sanders. He was shaken by a caregiver when he was just 8 weeks old, causing permanent brain damage.
Never shake a baby.
The findings in the brain of so-called shaken baby syndrome, in fact, can be caused by many different conditions. If a physician does not thoroughly investigate all of the various possibilities, he or she will come to a default diagnosis that shaking was involved.
Yes, that was in the literature. That was taught to us by our teachers. Many of these alleged shaken baby syndrome cases where the babies were sick, and it was probably the medical illness. There are other conditions that can look just like it.
Now, in addition, there is increasing awareness that you can't cause brain damage by shaking without first causing neck damage. The neck is the weak point. I don't think it's a good idea for a parent to shake a child, but I have never seen a case in which there has been neck damage. None.
Particularly in a little baby with no head control, and babies can't pick their heads up until they're almost 4 months old, you would have to transmit whatever forces were going to get to the head through the neck, and you would expect to see damage to the neck also. I've never seen any real neck injuries. As a mechanical justification for shaking, they all referenced one single paper, and that paper was written by Ayub Omaya. Dr. Ayub Omaya was a mentor. He was able to produce brain injury in monkeys by putting them in a sled and hitting the back of the sled with a piston and having a head whip violently back and forth. He also made neck injuries too, by the way. What he told me was that he got a telephone call from John Caffey, and he said, I tried to tell them, but they wouldn't listen.
Essential part of shaking, if shaking is in place, is damage to the neck. Unless you have damage to the cervical system, you cannot produce the effects on the brain.
If you stop and think and ask yourself, could this be physically possible? And take an objective look at whether it can or not, the answer comes up, no.
I've been involved throughout my career with prosecution of child abuse cases. A battered child will usually have multiple injuries that occurred over various times. But people are being charged and convicted for crimes that just simply did not occur. Married couples, professional daycare operators, everybody.
It's an almost impossible task to find out how many people are charged or convicted because they're not charged or convicted with shaken baby syndrome. People are charged with homicide or child abuse, manslaughter, child neglect. So you would have to comb through all those cases across the country to figure out which ones involve shaken baby syndrome accusations. It would be a huge undertaking.
There are people who are in prison and their convictions are based on science that has now been disavowed. Over the years, over the past decades, these hundreds of cases and convictions have resulted in nearly 1,000 people who are in prison for this type of crime. So my estimates are based on the case law, the published appellate opinion, which is a really very approximate measure of what's going on with these cases. The numbers of cases that we would be talking about in the shaken baby context they're much greater than the numbers that we're talking about with respect to DNA exonerations, at least to date. It would seem to me that there are at least hundreds of cases every year that involve this type of prosecution.
It has resulted in literally thousands of families who have been destroyed.
They're terrified. You see families getting broken up. You see children being separated.
She told the judge, "Please don't take me away from my children."
And it's like a nightmare.
She's not responsible for what they're accusing her, for what she's been incarcerated erroneously.
It's hell. It's pure hell.
There are many, many physicians and scientists who do in fact understand. Well over 100 physicians and scientists in a number of specialties, neuropathologists, pediatricians, physicists, that first started out as a contacts list We developed a network, and the common theme for this group has been to have a scientifically rigorous approach. Oh, Maya was there right to the end. I'm involved in approximately 100 cases right now, and half of those are pro bono, and the others are, for the most part, public defender cases.
We thought we were helping by uncovering these other medical conditions that can look like abuse but are not. It actually threatens the entire shaken baby syndrome working group and industrial complex.
They have an ideology that they have adopted very, very firmly.
I had absolutely no idea what I was up against. This has been a strange, heartbreaking journey.
Since I work in the military, we do stay on the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base here at Tucson, so we live in the base housing. Met my wife in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We worked together, different schools. We got married at 19, joined the military a month after my son was born, and I've been pretty much bouncing all over since then.
My daughter's name is Rachel. At 3.5 weeks old, we took her to the hospital for a fever and vomiting. They admitted her. She was in the hospital for 4 days. And at the same time, my son was sick. We came home, took her to the follow-up, and then a few days later, she was back in the hospital for throwing up. They released her the same day, and then we took her to a follow-up on that. So then the doctor came in and said she didn't want to, but she had to call Child Protective Services because they were required by law to call them. And then we actually got arrested.
Those are classic shaken baby injuries.
I don't know. I really, swear to God, don't know. Do you know how she's doing? Have you visited her?
No.
I want her treated. I want somebody there with her all the time so she's not alone. I want her treated. I don't want her to be alone.
All right. Now, you're telling me Joshua wouldn't do this. So
Right.
who does that leave?
Leaves me, but I would
There
never
you
do
go.
that. I would never hurt her.
Why would you hurt your baby?
We need to focus on how she got those injuries, and they did not happen at the hospital.
I don't know.
Okay?
See-
Samantha, did you cause the injuries?
No.
Okay, well, if you did not cause them, then Joshua did it. Is it possible that he could have snapped for 1 minute when you were taking a nap and he's trying to play his video game and the baby's fussing, and, he's having to stop his game to deal with this baby?
No.
There's been accusations right from the beginning saying, no, you had to have done this.
These are all classic signs of the baby being shaken.
Okay.
Someone shook that baby. Okay, and someone shook that baby within the last week.
Okay.
Okay? I need you to tell me how that could have happened.
I have no idea.
None whatsoever.
No, I don't.
Somebody did something to her, and it's either you or Samantha.
I understand.
Okay? You need to tell me, Josh.
I'm telling you.
Okay, and I don't believe you. Like I said, we only have two choices. You or Samantha.
That's fine. You can point it towards me. My wife did not do this.
It is pointing to you.
Okay.
You're telling me she didn't do it.
I know my wife would not do this.
But how do you know? You're not with her.
We were only there probably about 12 hours, and then we were released. They took both children. I'm trying so hard not to cry. I cried and I cried. I cried for months. And I didn't know how I was going to live without my kids because my kids were my everything. Rachel was 6 weeks old when she was taken, and Robbie was 7. And at the time, they went to 2 different foster families. She was 9 months when she finally got placed with my son. I got to meet Robbie's foster parents and knew they were good people, and they were both in a safe house.
The foster parents were straightforward with us. They said if we followed what we were supposed to do, they would make time out of their time to get with us and we can hang out more. And they held true to that.
If we are found guilty and convicted, we, I believe, face up to 60 years in jail. It's uncertain. You don't know what's going to happen. It makes me sick to my stomach. It scares me to death. I kept looking for answers, and I would spend day and night researching everything I could possibly research.
From what I understand, I guess there's been findings as far as vitamin D deficiency. There's been some kind of a deficiency in her that could be the problem that could have caused all this.
Very severe vitamin D deficiencies in pregnant mothers, passed on to the fetus. The fetus is born as a newborn, gets no supplementation during that. No one goes out in the sun anymore. It's an international and national epidemic. It's all throughout the literature.
Which they can no longer test for, because as long as you have formula that has vitamin D in it, or milk, or anything like that, it cures the vitamin D deficiency. She's a normal 2-year-old. I was like everybody else. When you watched a child abuse case, you automatically assume. But now being on the other side of that, we did not do this to our daughter. How could innocent people go to jail?
There are a group of physicians who have persisted in the belief system. Reese, Chadwick, and Jenny have all been members of the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Child Abuse and Neglect. Chairwomen of departments of pediatrics at major universities.
Usually the people who do this act on impulse. Stop crying. Stop crying.
If somebody was going to say, you know, do you want to hit a baby or do you want to shake them? I'd say, oh, please hit them. These kids that are shaken have such universal injuries.
It's not absolutely proven, but it's proven to a very high level of certainty.
When they say something, other physicians listen and assume that what they're saying is correct. I assumed that for many years.
In the 70s and 80s, child abuse was finally starting to get the attention it deserved after being unrecognized as a problem. And doctors Reese, Chadwick, and Jenny were at the forefront of that movement. All 3 doctors have continued to lead the field and are considered big heroes for children and families.
I think Dr. Chadwick, he exposed the fact that a lot of children were being abused. But I think there's a lot of other aspects of his career where he's caused people to be imprisoned who weren't guilty. And he was often pushing things that weren't legitimate scientific evidence. The ritual abuse syndrome was a panic that swept through the country, that there were organized gangs of people, the Satanists, infiltrating daycare centers. It was this really crazy theory that this was going on in a lot of places, that the children were taken to secret houses and abused, beat them, covered them with chocolates, stabbed them, raped them.
You were never able to find any real evidence, and I've consulted on several hundred of them.
It was imaginary, but it was being used to convict people and send them to prison. All of these horrible things ranging from a baby being killed in the classroom to actually a giraffe being killed.
California's McMartin preschool scandal. It began as the most notorious child abuse case in American history, with charges that hundreds of youngsters had been sexually molested at the now-defunct nursery.
Authorities see the case as a symbol of an increasing national tragedy.
Abused in satanic rituals, Jay Shadler investigated their world of covens and sacrifices.
Part of that was driven by Chadwick's Children's Hospital here. Their conference they put on annually was instrumental in spreading that theory. And there was no skeptical presentation of this. And I remember sitting in that room and just thinking I was in the Twilight Zone. It was so strange. But no one else seemed to think it was strange. And their egos, their overzealousness, I think advocacy turned into lunacy. There were just books after books of satanic child abuse and signs of it, checklists for how you would find it.
While Dr. Chadwick was indoctrinating medical professionals and prosecutors at his conferences, Doctors Reese and Jenny were legitimizing it and spreading it.
I didn't know about the satanic ritual involvement. I knew of the trials, I knew of the charges, but I did not know who the physicians were behind it at all. I would be very surprised if any of the people that I work with or know personally are aware of that.
I mean, these were serious cases of abuse by the authorities. The physicians rejected the conclusions. It was the backlash, they called it. It was part of the people not wanting to believe the reality of child abuse and that this was a backlash against their efforts to curtail it.
There was once a time when I naively believed that if you presented a certain amount of common sense and logic to these people, you could change their mind. And what I discovered is there's nothing you can say, there's no amount of common sense and logic or investigation that you can use. They have an alternative explanation that is consistent with their belief in this conspiracy.
Some of them were in prison for 10, 12, 20 years.
I've been locked up in prison 18 years for a crime I didn't commit.
When the truth eventually came out about satanic ritual abuse, no one disciplined them over their involvement in any way. Not their universities, not their hospitals. No one held any kind of public inquiry into what happened. These doctors in this new field of child abuse were able to just move right along to their next theory.
David Chadwick lobbied in the early 90s to have shaken baby syndrome specifically included as a medical diagnosis, and he was successful.
America was about to see the syndrome debut in one of the most watched trials in U.S. history. This trial would bring together the lead doctors, catalyzing them onto a quest for scientific truth.
It involved a child of 2 physicians, a nanny in Boston.
An emotionally charged case, a teenage au pair is accused of murdering an infant, an 8-month-old infant. 19-year-old Louise Woodward faces charges of murder in the first degree.
Could you give us an idea of what you would do with the children during the course of a typical day?
Used to prepare the meals, play with their favourite toys, read books. Then we used to read with Matthew. Matthew would look at the pictures and we'd dance to music.
The state claims the nanny shook the infant.
The central position of the defense, supported by medical testimony, theorized that Matthew Eapen's death was caused by an earlier injury.
He was lying there. His eyes were half closed. He wasn't focusing. He was gasping for breath.
I was not involved. I only knew about the trial from what I had read in the newspaper. It was at that point that I realized that you could actually apply the science of biomechanics to evaluation of an injury.
Unless you have damage to the cervical system, you cannot produce the effects on the brain.
Were there such injuries in this case?
There were no injuries in this case.
I got a phone call from Omaya. We started out as a professor and student. We became colleagues and we became very good friends. And he said he had a case he wanted me to look at. I was provided with and read all the articles on the so-called shaken baby syndrome that were in existence, but there wasn't any science behind it. It was a lot of circular reasoning and a lot of anecdotal experience. And I realized that there was no such thing. So I went over to his office and he flipped up a CT scan of the brain, and I immediately saw that it's an old injury. The individual who was taking care of the baby was charged with first-degree murder, having inflicted that injury on that baby on that day, the day the scan was made, which is anatomically not possible.
This bleed-rebleed theory, it just doesn't apply in pediatrics. It may apply in adult medicine, but it doesn't apply in pediatrics at all.
So are you calling the doctors who testified for the defense quacks?
No, I'm not calling them anything.
Well, that's the conclusion one would draw. So this never happens in babies?
That's just not true. I'd be happy to send the good doctor some reprints.
I think that that is a theory that isn't supported by a single reported case. There's been no peer review on it. It's not precisely unique because I've heard it before in other cases.
This syndrome doesn't make sense.
What I see every day in surgery and what I was encountering with regards to various people's opinions were at complete variance. And there were lots of people who were very much willing to give opinions on things about which they really didn't know anything.
These people were not using good, sound, up-to-date scientific literature for child abuse, and that's not acceptable. We've got to be prepared to testify in the field that we're testifying in.
Very quickly, Dr. Omaya, your response to that? That's nonsense, because I've read all the child abuse literature, and the question of a shaken baby syndrome is really in the realm of mythology.
You know, you begin to feel like you're participating in an Alice in Wonderland scenario. And it was not a pleasant experience for me getting into court and saying something that was pretty obvious to me and being cross-examined in the way that I was, but they were going to make this a landmark case.
Dr. Robert Reese demonstrates how severe shaking can cause terrible injuries to a tiny, fragile brain, the condition called shaken baby syndrome.
We gave them science, and the prosecution gave them hysteria.
He's fussy, he's cranky, and she can't stand it. So she grabs Matty Ethan, and she shakes him. He keeps fussing, and she keeps shaking.
I was not only at the Boston Children's Hospital, but the Harvard Medical School. And I was at that time writing 2 chapters on child abuse and imaging of child abuse. So when the Epen baby came through Children's Hospital, I did look at the baby's CAT scans and CT scans of the brain injury. We were approached by the prosecutors to please assist in terms of the prosecution of that case. I was pretty much in lockstep with shaken baby syndrome. I was reading nothing else other than the pediatric literature and the child abuse literature. I never questioned the science behind it. I didn't even know about biomechanical science then. When I testified, I followed the line that this had to be shaking. I saw the credentials of these expert witnesses across the board. I said, you know, why are these people doing this? I never questioned it.
The jury will be deciding tomorrow. They are the sole judges of the facts.
or not guilty?
Guilty.
The jury.
There's no question we will appeal and we will not rest until we overturn this conviction because it's unjust.
She was sitting before Judge Hiller Zobel as he dramatically reduced her sentence from life to time served. Louise Woodward was now free after serving 9 months in custody.
That particular experience made me go outside. I'm going to go outside the books and the teachers, and I'm going to do my own digging and see what they're quoting, what they're citing, and if they're properly citing and quoting it. And let's look into what the real experts are saying. Neurosurgeons, neuropathologists about the brain. They're the experts in the brain. And with regard to trauma, let's go see what the experts are really saying in the literature. So I started reading and looking into all those areas, which really opened my eyes. Then I had realized that this had gone too far with what I had done. I was going through this period where I was just absolutely in a state of trepidation. So I had a great difficulty living with that. So I said, we've got to get this right. We've just got to get it right. I saw it as the right and important thing to do, and that I need to take a more individualized approach to looking at this myself instead of just walking lockstep with the group on this.
We know what killed Maddie Eapen. It was massive injury to the brain that resulted from violent shaking.
Just at about the time of the Woodward trial, the National Shaken Baby Syndrome Center opened, and they have received, well, over the years, it's been millions of dollars of private funding and government funding. And it has a board of directors that includes people like Chadwick and Jenny and Reese. The National Shaken Baby Syndrome Center sells teaching materials, some are to be used by prosecutors as an aid in prosecuting these cases. Many states have passed laws requiring education. Puts on programs every year or two.
I uncovered tapes from the National Shaken Baby Syndrome Center Conference in 1998, and it was shocking to hear how these Shaken Baby Syndrome leaders convinced prosecutors and doctors to go along with their program.
Welcome to the National Conference on Shaken Baby Syndrome in Salt Lake City, Utah.
I have a passion for making sure that information gets transmitted, whether it's absolutely true, partially true, or maybe even false, but we need to get the information out there. There is a lot you can do, and we should do it, and we should get out and very aggressively do it.
And I think we have to go out and look in certain emergency departments where we can influence the criteria for doing studies and looking at kids a little more intensively that come in with some of these other syndromes in order to improve the levels of recognition.
I'm delighted that there's so many people here in law enforcement, and I would wonder how many people think this is going to change their practice in investigations. Where are the hidden cases? Anybody agree with that? That this is that you've learned something that's going to change the way you approach cases? A couple of people. Good, good. Now, you guys aren't being a very good audience. Let's try this again. Now, we need a big sign that says, everybody clap. Everybody raise your hands. Now, let's get with the program here. You're not going to get your marshmallows.
Prosecutions just went nuts.
Daycare provider Audrey Edmonds was convicted in the death of 7-month-old Natalie Beard. Natalie showed signs of shaken baby syndrome.
Suzanne Johnson, another daycare operator, accused.
I felt that it was my responsibility as a physician and just as a human being to try to make sure that people being charged had the opportunity to have scientifically correct information.
When he is certain about something, he's willing to act upon it. And if that means that you stand up for someone who needs it, then that's what you do.
Well, my father was an attorney. Actually, he was a judge. He was the youngest judge ever appointed in Minnesota. He was 29 years old. Every fifth Saturday, one of the judges would have the Saturday court. So I used to go down to court with him. I was only a 7, 8, 9-year-old kid, so I got to see firsthand how the system worked at a very young age.
When John became interested in this, he spent a couple of years simply learning physics.
I realized that I needed to know more, and that the easiest way for me to do that was to contact the people that were actually doing the studies. It was a rather remarkable experience to be able to talk with Thibault and Omaya and learn about these things.
I have a conscience, and I believe in a couple of archaic concepts, and one of them is that you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, and another one is you're supposed to speak the truth. And so I didn't choose this path. It chose me. The biggest thing I had to go through was resolving it with my family, because I knew it was going to take a lot out, but the children are solidly behind me, and my wife certainly has been a bedrock of support.
It's primarily because of the children and families. You know, that's really what we're thinking about. We need to help keep them together, not to destroy them. Going into medicine like my father did, part of our creed is first do no harm. And many more techniques came along to help us, particularly the magnetic resonance imaging, the MRI. That opened the door to help distinguish those causes from what we had said could only be due to shaken baby syndrome.
When I started to review cases, I began to understand that trauma from a fall, for example, an accident was being misinterpreted as being due to shaking, violent shaking. Almost always, the injuries that were found were exactly what you would expect from that type of an event. Once you get to be a toddler, toddlers can fall. That's why they're called toddlers. They're toddling around. If the child only has an isolated injury, let's say a head injury, I think that I need to be very, very cautious in interpreting that injury. David Chadwick, one of his early articles on this topic, in which he categorically states that a low-velocity impact, a fall from a changing table, for example, could not cause injury. That if the history is a fall, the caretakers are lying. And I said, boy, you know, if you're talking about adults can suffer a fatal head injury from a ground-level fall.
Sudden and shocking death of Tony winner Natasha Richardson.
The 45-year-old actress died 2 days after what seemed at the time to be a harmless tumble on the bunny slope of a Canadian ski resort. Witnesses say she was even joking about her fall until a worsening headache hours later sent her to a local hospital.
Actor Gary Coleman has died.
He fell at his home and was rushed to a hospital.
Who died of an intracranial hemorrhage, basically a brain hemorrhage.
Why isn't the same thing true for children? I looked at the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission database involving playground equipment, and there were 18 fall-related fatalities over about an 11-year period. So I was able to obtain all of the medical records, the autopsy reports, all of the police reports, scene photographs, accident reconstructions, etc., for all of these cases. And 2/3 of them were actually witnessed. One of them was videotaped. And so I was able to prove that children can suffer fatal head injuries from a low-level fall. In some cases, as little as about 2.5 or 3 feet, even apparently innocuous impact head injury.
Could fall and hit their head on one of these metal poles or even this plastic platform. And depending on the force of that blow and where they hit their head, that injury can actually be life-threatening.
I just assumed that once physicians realized they were wrong, that they would just simply say, gee, I was wrong. Everybody just went nuts.
Because I'm pathologically compliant, I'm going to talk about falls for 30 seconds because I said I would. And this is the conclusions of my fall talk, which is that they don't contribute importantly to infant and child mortality anymore.
Little kids are supposed to wear helmets when they're riding tricycles. Well, if these falls don't hurt children, why do they have to wear helmets?
People tried to look for various explanations as to why what I had shown was incorrect. I was accused of altering the videotape. It was pointed out by many of us, how does shaking explain a skull fracture? The response was, well, it was both shaking and slamming that caused the injury.
The whole point of the shaken baby syndrome is there is no impact. So now it changes from the shaken baby syndrome to the shaken impact syndrome.
Shaking alone can produce brain damage. Of course, slamming a baby can do that too, and there's other ways to do it.
They tried to stress that the characteristics of the head injury from a fall are different from the characteristics of an inflicted injury, which is bizarre reasoning and not true. The brain does not know whether an injury was intentional or accidental.
It's hard for me to describe because it makes no sense.
It's really hard to imagine that the usual simple household fall is going to kill somebody. This is what Plunkett would lead us to believe. Inflicted brain injury and falls look just the same. But in fact, based on Chadwick's data, if there is an overlap, the overlap is very, very slight.
Frequently, parents or caretakers would bring an injured child into the hospital after a fall or some similar event, seeking help, and would be arrested, almost regardless of the circumstances.
Police described what happened, alleging that Sardisco, quote, recklessly caused serious physical injury to the brain of a child by shaking the child or by slamming or throwing the child.
Police say Watts either shook the baby or slammed him against something.
I've tried to show in court that the fall was the most likely explanation, not necessarily the explanation. One of the first cases in which I did this was Lisa Stickney case about 10 years ago.
At some point I had called the hospital because I wanted to see how this, Zeph was doing. They said he was critical, but they wouldn't give me any details. I was charged with first-degree murder. I was facing 25 to life. We were afraid for our children, what they were going to try to do with our children. They had me in the jail there for a year. They kept extending the date for our trial, so it was really hard. Our oldest was confused and scared. It was hard for her not having me. I had never been away from her. All I could tell her was that I loved her, that things were gonna be okay. I think there was at one point where she was demanding her father to come get me. But yeah, that was really hard.
They had offered a plea bargain a few days before. And I remember Lisa asking me, should I take it? Should I take it? 5 years is better than life. And even one of our attorneys said, you might want to consider it. And Lisa said, no, we're gonna fight this. And at that point, we started to assemble a team to fight this.
During my trial, it did come out that he had a head injury the night before.
A witness came forward that he had run into a brick wall and hit his head and fell completely back and hit the floor. So Dr. Antonius, who's the blood doctor, showed through the blood work that the child had a declining health and then also had a blood disorder. And then John Plunkett was incredible. And they gave him such a hard time. I mean, they tried to stop John at every single point that they could. They wouldn't let him share any of his videos.
Very serious situation. And I think that surprised me the most, that they weren't going to allow these doctors that had scientific information. They had videos. I can't even tell you what I was feeling. Just that moment of, your life's either going to go one way or the other. And it's scary. It's a scary place to be.
And then to hear the not guilty, and then there was a second count too, not guilty again, was just freeing. It's like this huge weight was lifted finally. Thanks to John's efforts, the other doctor's efforts, the truth was able to come to the surface.
My name is Kevin Hyatt. I live here in Macon, Missouri. I'm a Missouri State Highway Patrolman. I'm a sergeant. Right now, I take care of the evidence and do some training at our headquarters here in Macon. I've lived here pretty much all my life. There's 10 or 12 years I worked about 30 miles south of here.
I've lived in Macon, all of our married life, but I grew up about 30 miles south of here in the same town that he lived in for a while, and that's how we met. I am a stay-at-home mom that's never home because I'm busy all the time. She was sitting on my couch, and I turned just for that split second, and I heard a thud. I could hear her crying, and I was like, oh, thank God. I was just so happy that she had woke up. That evening while I was there, these two men walked into the room. He asked me all kinds of questions like, did I throw her on the bed? I can't even remember everything he said to me, but I was like, no, why would I do something like that to her? I love her. I was charged with a Class B felony of abuse of a child / shaken baby syndrome with emotional injury, 5 to 15 years in prison. Emotionally, I was a mess.
Yeah, I was stunned. I'm just like, no, this can't be. Just walking in and looking at a few symptoms and saying that this is a crime. Went straight to an accusatory thing. Well, the doctor said this, so it had to be. And Kathy, tell us why you did it, kind of thing. I mean, I've been involved in law enforcement for, well, soon to be 29 years. And it just floored me that something like this could just be, the finger be pointed at somebody over so little information. I think that was my whole deal. I was floored. I was just flabbergasted.
I was terrified. All I had ever wanted to be was a mom and a wife, and I saw all that wanting to be taken away from me. If one of those big wig doctors could go through what they've put us through, maybe they would understand how wrong they are. I don't know. Do they have feelings like that inside of them? I don't know.
Melissa was 9 when it happened, and watch what was going on. And the things being said about her mother that she knew wasn't true. And, you know, she was tough about it all, but, you know, I know it had an effect on her, you know.
It's just not fair.
You know, here we're considered ourselves good citizens of the community. That was such a hard pill to swallow, and here I was involved in law enforcement. I'm supposed to be an example, you know. We had to rely on other people to help us. We really did. I was totally helpless. You know, I took care of business. I can take care of my family, but in this situation, I couldn't do it. There was no way, so we had to call on Dr. Plunkett, had to call on friends. We went to a local church here in town. We packed the place out with people there to help Kathy out, you know. We got much support from the people within this town, letters, phone calls. I think we had like almost 200 witnesses, character witnesses, that we had contacted these folks that said they would come in.
Through all of my research, that is how I found Dr. Plunkett. That's when I told Kevin, I said, we have to use Dr. Plunkett.
In the media, it was played up pretty big, and, you know, that was embarrassing. And the whole thing was so stressful. We went 2.5 days, almost 3 days of trial.
Jurors took just 30 minutes to make up their minds in the case. Once again, Kathy Jo Hyatt found not guilty on a child abuse charge.
Whenever they said not guilty, it was just like a ton of bricks had taken off my shoulders.
Dr. Plunkett and many other doctors traveled across the country defending people in these cases where kids had fallen or were sick, and in the process came up against the shaken baby syndrome promoters. After winning several prominent court cases, it looked like this might end the way satanic ritual abuse did. Shaken baby syndrome leaders were showing signs of strain.
We've all had the experience of being fairly eloquent on the stand and then having an acquittal, which we walk out of the courtyard feeling frustrated. But these things keep coming up.
Miles Ferguson from Portsmouth is accused of shaking his baby to death. She died 2 years ago on a family vacation to Myrtle Beach. And that's where testimony continued today in the trial against a husband and a father who insists he did nothing wrong.
Miles Lee sat sobbing, holding his wife's hand.
With Dr. Uzinski, the defense has painted a picture that two small problems combined to create breathing trouble and hemorrhaging in Miley.
The native of Portsmouth has been found not guilty by a jury.
I
A Valley woman who faced execution in the death of a child has been cleared of all charges.
I loved Dylan as if he were my own.
Lisa was the victim of a witch hunt.
You are guilty when you are accused until you can prove yourself innocent.
Today, Maricopa County Attorney Rick Romley dropped the charge against her. This is the first time in 10 years a capital murder case has been dismissed in Maricopa County.
Ronald Osinski is a nationally recognized critic of shaken baby syndrome.
I don't know that this child was a victim of head trauma at all.
After a 4-day trial, jurors didn't buy the prosecution's case and found Brown not guilty.
The only thing I could do to protect her was to love her every day, try to assure that I wasn't going anywhere, and try to get the right help that she deserved.
I was working with the public defender's office in Boise, Idaho, and the prosecutor told the defense attorney that I was being charged with perjury in Oregon because of testimony in a previous case. I said, I know nothing about that. My first reaction when I learned that I had been charged was that I was shocked and discovered that it was the Lisa Stickney case.
You know, these doctors should have the freedom to speak out. And I think it was just devastating to what degree they went after John.
One of the charges was that I had testified that, and this is directly what I said, to the best of my knowledge, I have never testified in the same trial as Mary Case from St. Louis. It turns out that Mary Case and I had in fact testified on 2 trials. I had not met her. I was not aware that she had testified in those trials because she wasn't there in person. She had testified by video link, and I just was not aware of it.
He didn't remember that there were apparently a couple of trials where they testified in the same trial. Now, just stop for a second. So what? Who cares? What difference does it make? I have not seen a prosecutor bring these kinds of charges against an expert in my... I haven't seen this happen. This doesn't happen. I mean, you see abusive charging, but this is so over the top. It's so reckless and wrong. The prosecutor has to be fair. The prosecutor has to be impartial. The prosecutor has to behave as a professional. It's the most dangerous power of all, charging somebody with a crime. And in the hands of a ruthless prosecutor who can abuse his powers without any accountability, to silence him, to hurt him, to get him out of court, the courtrooms. Just think of that for a second.
Then what effect would that have on people like Lisa and Aaron Stickney? That's just not fair. And others who at that point were just starting to come forth and say, we need to do something about this. I was incensed.
Come here, you old bat. Come on. She's 28.
The state offered me a plea deal. They would suspend jail time. I'd have to pay a fine of like $5,000 and swear that I would never testify at the request of the defense in Oregon again. And I said something to the effect of, no, I'm not going to do that. I had a tremendous number of people that offered to come out there at their own expense and testify. Tremendous support. Went to trial, and the judge found me not guilty and wrote a very nice written opinion as to why. Pointing out, among other things, that there's absolutely no reason for me to have known that Mary Case had testified in the same case that I had testified on, especially since she wasn't even there.
He's been able to stick with the science and not get discouraged. What we went through was very small compared to what some of these families have endured. And I have the utmost sympathy for them.
I have not been intimidated, and certainly it did not make me reconsider my willingness to become involved. Not at all.
Many people would have given up, most people would have given up a long time ago. I think that's the reason that he's been one of the leaders in this issue.
Public debate was not welcomed. The shaken baby syndrome meeting did not allow for any debate. As a matter of fact, the two most recent meetings, there was not even a question and answer session. The debate that occurred was really in the press, where it was basically a he says, she says type of approach without any attempt at validation of certain scientific principles.
When attorneys turned to them to help free innocent people who'd been in prison for years and were finally getting their appeals heard, they took on cases across the country.
Appeals are very difficult for a defendant to win, and almost always unsuccessful. Motions for a new trial are even more difficult.
It was not only a way to help get people out of prison, but to bring attention to this issue in a new, really powerful way that could bring this whole thing down.
For years, shaken baby syndrome has been considered a scientific fact and used to convict people.
Ken Marsh served 21 years in prison.
I'm standing next to a man I've been trying to free for a long time.
Chadwick and other experts testified against him. Medical experts who recently reviewed the case cast doubt on the conviction.
10 years ago, there were very few physicians who were questioning this. Now there are literally hundreds across the nation who are looking at the science and saying, wait.
Even the neuropathologist who published some of the original research decades ago has since retracted his view.
These fatal cases were being regarded as due to shaking simply because nobody could think of any other explanation.
Scientists say that there are serious questions about that syndrome and how it's diagnosed.
It is bound to spark controversy about whether people have been wrongly accused of child abuse. The British Medical Journal editorial concludes by calling on all doctors to reconsider the diagnostic criteria, if not the existence, of shaken baby syndrome in all cases.
Shirley Smith has served 10 years in prison for murder.
I can't believe this has happened.
For his first time ever, California Governor Jerry Brown granted clemency.
The fact that appeals have been successful is very encouraging for other people to appeal.
The reasons Edmond says she's innocent could affect other shaken baby cases around the country. I spent just days shy of 11 years in prison. The medical and scientific evidence proves that she was not shaken.
We presented 6 medical experts, really top-notch people in the field, including the chief of pediatric neuroradiology at Stanford University Medical School.
I think it's a tribute to the quality of their judges. They have been willing to look at these cases and overturn them.
We don't want to believe that people will do this kind of thing to children, so we're always looking for reasons to prove that they didn't do it.
Robert Block is one of the pediatricians who's been involved in this area for a long time.
What about the babies who are killed? What about the babies who are neurologically impaired forever? Why do they not count? Why is the only person we're concerned about the person who might have been innocent who went to jail? So if you have make up a number, 300-400 people who agree to the science and one person who doesn't. Does that really mean that there's a controversy? Does that really mean that there's new science?
So what is happening inside that child's body?
Some of that's a little bit up for further resolution now, because you obviously can't shake a baby, and a real baby, and observe what's going on.
They, in essence, said that actual science experimentation has no role to play in this syndrome, because you can't shake real living children, and anything else is not acceptable in terms of evidence.
Well, okay. Let's let it be controversial for a while longer until we find some better data. We turn to science where science comes our way.
It is very convenient to pick and choose what you want to believe to be true. Jenny's studies, which go back 10, 12 years, and yet have resulted in no publications of the data. And Jenny's response to that is, biomechanical studies are of no value unless they confirm what we already know to be true.
Now, this is not a child. This is a piece of wood with a head on it. To say that biomechanical data trumps clinical experience is just not a very realistic position to take.
That's a bullshit statement. The science of biomechanics is behind every safety device that we have for everyday use, which seem to be fine for those purposes.
The American Academy of Pediatrics now says that young children should be in a rear-facing child seat until the age of 2.
But if they don't support your preconceived notion, certain people say that they're invalid.
I think the use of these crash test dummies in the legal setting, in the courtroom, highly suspect.
The undercurrent is, but we're the experts and we know that this is the truth. We know this is the truth because we're the experts.
So there is a literature. Some would say it's not very good, it doesn't rise to the level of fine evidence-based medicine, but then there's a lot in medicine that doesn't conform to that kind of criteria.
I think it's probably really bad for babies to shake them, and I think it's probably really bad for babies to whack them in the head, and it's probably really bad to do both. So there's no doubt in my mind that shaking hurts, impact hurts, both hurt, and it's hard for us sometimes to know what actually happens in these cases. The assumptions we're making really cannot be validated at this point by the scientific literature.
And stop charging people.
We're going to have to go by inferred information, inductive reasoning, and that sort of thing to come up with the kinds of things that we have.
But you don't stick with an ideology and try to make the facts fit the ideology. It's precisely the opposite.
So we turned to indirect ways of trying to figure this out. Perpetrator admissions.
They have no other place to go. They have to go to confessions.
And they tell us, here's what I did. Now, how in the world can you just forget about all of that because somebody has an alternative hypothesis? That doesn't make any sense to me.
It's a beyond reason to assume that every person who admits to shaking a baby is lying.
So many of these cases are resulting in guilty pleas before trial. And that in itself is not surprising because the vast majority of cases in the criminal justice system do end that way. But what's striking about the shaken baby pleas, and many of them, though of course not all, is that the disparity between what the defendant is facing if she goes to trial and loses and the offer and the sentence that she'll receive if she pleads guilty is enormous. And so, for instance, a defendant may be facing 25 years to life if she's convicted of the charged crime, but she's being offered time served when she goes to trial, so maybe a year or 2 in jail. I think it's very reasonable to assume that many of these deals are very attractive to defendants who are facing a lot more time if they are convicted.
I'm scared, Mr. Blair. I was terrified of spending the rest of my life in prison. Even though I know I'm innocent, no, I don't regret taking the plea.
And I think that the pressures that are brought to bear in these interrogation rooms are so enormous. In many of these transcripts that I've reviewed, these suspects are being told that we know what you did. The science proves it. The only way that you can help yourself, the only way that you can see your baby is to admit to what you did. And of course, it's, well, at least for me, really easy to imagine that under those conditions, someone would say just about anything. And you know, the other point is that many of these so-called confessions, I think, are not at all confessions. So many suspects will admit to shaking a baby in the course of revival efforts.
I have a 911 tape where the 911 operator is telling the person at the other end to shake the child to see if he can be revived.
Pediatricians will point to these confessions as proof that this happened and proof of guilt and proof that this goes on. And that may have to do in large part with the challenge to the science that's coming from many of these defense experts.
There's a cult of irrationality that is amongst us. And irrationality is always difficult to overcome when we're trying to talk about this information.
So why should we be addressing irrationality at a conference on child maltreatment? Because it affects our work every day. Recall the elements of irrationality: denial.
What Dr. Reese is trying to imply is that physicians and perhaps members of the jury deny that child abuse exists. That has been one of the common charges against me.
Some obvious examples of denial leading to irrational thinking include the denial of genocides.
It's become much more vocal, much more personal, and I think a good example of that would be the Atlanta Shaken Baby Syndrome Conference just last year.
The National Shaken Baby Syndrome Center wouldn't allow filming at their conference, but I got hold of a secretly recorded audio tape from someone in the audience at Brian Holmgren's session. Holmgren, who's a Tennessee prosecutor, led a sing-along, mocking Dr. Plunkett and the other defense experts.
I want to leave you today with a little bit of fun. I have invited Dr. John Sterling to come and share with you. I hope you will find it entertaining. We're going to do this karaoke style. I will sing. There is no basis for the claim to making cases for my opinions and demands. I will tell you why the state's proof is not there. Make my claims for causes that are very rare. No proof for them? Why should I care? I don't care just what the doc says. I'll claim a shortfall always protesting on the stand.
This is very troubling conduct by a prosecutor. I haven't seen prosecutors do this. I can't think of a case where a prosecutor has participated in a song fest on issues and subject matters that are so critical.
There's quite a bit of pushback, more so than before. A lot of it has been in the form of intimidation, sometimes threats. A number of emails have come in directly to me regarding how long are you going to keep this up? Used to be highly respected. You really need to stop to this. This could potentially harm you. What does that mean?
When they changed the name to abusive head trauma, it then became clear to me the lengths to which they would go.
Names like shaken baby syndrome and shaken impact syndrome have recently been questioned as being appropriate terms. As a matter of fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics shortly will issue a new technical report. One of the things that they're going to recommend is that we call this abusive head trauma.
Now shaking is so controversial, they had to get away from specificity and get to something much more general. Let's increase the size of the umbrella.
And so how do you fight against a diagnosis of abusive head trauma when they haven't even defined how the injury occurred? They openly say, freely admit that they don't know, but they know it's abuse.
Shaken baby syndrome, shaken impact syndrome, non-accidental injury, abusive head trauma. It's the ideology. We are the ones who know how to recognize child abuse. We are the experts. You must believe us.
I think we can get away with it.
So I want to welcome Dr. Robert Block, the current president of the American Academy of Pediatrics.
One of our biggest problems is abusive head trauma and the shaken baby syndrome.
A man convicted of killing his 3-month-old son cried during his sentencing, telling the judge he loved his son. They said the boy suffered abusive head trauma.
Hunt shook his daughter Presley to death. Cause of death? Doctors say abusive head trauma.
It's rather unbelievable. Mark Diaz is a pediatric neurosurgeon from Hershey, Pennsylvania. He asked me to debate Carol Jenny at a meeting that he sponsors.
It was finally a chance to get into one of their events in front of a huge group of doctors who make the diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome, now abusive head trauma.
I was hoping that people would start to think. Carol Jenny backed out. I have no idea why. So it was a month before. Mark Diaz, the conference organizer, stepped in and took her place. I am involved in 4 post-conviction relief cases in which he had testified at the original trial. My impression at the time was that Diaz wanted to present several sides of several issues.
I promise that I will not use the term, John, you ignorant slut. The point is you evaluate it objectively and scientifically. I would really prefer that we get rid of this concept of child abuse until proved otherwise. I'll tell you, if I hear another validation based on confessions and convictions, I'm going to barf. And yes, I think as a child, an infant can be seriously injured or killed from a low-level fall. Okay? I'm done. I'm not sure who I reached during that debate. I don't know if anyone's mind was changed.
Even though the shaken baby syndrome challengers have made a lot of progress and saved American families, they've only slowed the promoters who continue to work with prosecutors across the country to bring new charges against people.
More and more physicians are understanding correctly. However, there are still many physicians who do not understand these things correctly.
When scientific consensus shifts, our system needs to be sufficiently flexible to accommodate these new realities. And we don't yet have the mechanisms in place to do that. And that's something that I feel needs to change if we are to continue to do justice in shaken baby cases and beyond. So I think we'll have to be very creative in crafting an institutional response. And this is the time to do it.
All of these cases are going to need to be reopened, assuming that we're a civilized society and are willing to do that.
And of course, we need to think about the new cases that are coming into the system and how we're going to treat those.
Lately, I've been referred a case a day, 1 case a day. I physically can't keep up with this.
I don't think any parent or any child should have to go through this. I think it's just completely ridiculous and wrong. What upsets me the most about this whole thing is how it affects my children. My son's gonna remember this for the rest of his life.
I think that the American people just need to know they've been lied to. Exactly. And that's the bottom line. They've been lied to, and you need to know the truth about this. And all these doctors that's trying to help this whole situation out, they're our heroes, you know, because of what they're trying to do, and that they're promoting truth.
I'm in this for the short term and the long term. I have my valleys, and then I also climb back up.
All of us are going to stay in this for our entire professional careers.
I see it as science shining a light into darkness. And you can try to obscure the darkness by making more shadows, but sooner or later the light's going to come through.